Hello everyone, it's Lindsay from Millinery Hub, and this video is about blocking pins. So I'm going to talk about the different types of blocking pins that we can get. The first lot up are these, which are drawing pins or thumbtacks, or they've got lots of different names, but they're basically a pin, metal pin with a round part on it that you can push in with your thumb. Then we have these, which are very similar to the drawing pins, but they've got a plastic head rather than a metal one. The next type of pin are steel pins, much like a dressmaker's pin, and they come in different types. So there's a short, thin one like this, and then we have another type here that we used to sell, and finally these ones that I sell now, which are also a metal pin, just like this. So the first thing you need to think about when you're talking blocking pins is how they act on the block. They're all different sizes or thickness, and when you're blocking, you're pushing this pin into your block and making a hole in the block. There's no other way about it. As you can see up here now, I've got some measurements for the pins that I'm talking about today. You can see that the drawing pins are by far the thickest, and then we go down to our normal blocking pins that I sell here at Millinery Hub, and then the red drawing pins next, and the thinnest would be these tiny little lace pins. Is actually what they are. So in terms of thickness, there are two factors. There's the one is what I'm talking about with your blocks. So the thicker the pin, the more damage you do to your blocks. And if you're using thick pins a lot and you're using the block a lot, your block won't last as long. But I mean, it's not like your block's going to wear out after using it 4 times. It's a lot more than that. And I suppose what you've got to add up in your mind is whether that block, after you've used it 100 times and you end up ruining it, has it had its value for you. And I would say yes. If you've used your block that much that you've ruined it with pins, then I think it's time you can buy another block. So I don't use the thinnest pins because they have another weakness in blocking, and that's that they bend. I tried out 0.65 millimeter and 0.75 and 0.85, and after trialing them, any that were thinner than 0.85 really bent quite a lot when I was blocking. Because of that, I always use these pins that are 0.85 millimeters thick. But also, the bending factor is to do with what type of steel the pins are made of. And contrary to popular belief, nearly all blocking pins are made of plain steel, not stainless steel. They look shiny, but they can rust. So it's important also when you're blocking that you take your work off the block as soon as it's dry. If you're one of those milliners that perhaps blocks something and then leaves it to dry for a week, it might be okay. But if you're blocking, say, a white hood on a block, and you use especially PVA as a stiffener, you may find that you have rust marks where the pins are. There are a couple of bits of equipment that we use with blocking pins, and I want to show you them before we get on to blocking. So the first one that I always use when blocking is this, which is a thimble, a metal thimble. It's very important when you're using the steel pins for blocking, and I'll show you why when we get into it. So there's that one, and the thimble goes on your middle finger like that, because that's the finger we use to push pins into the block. The next tool is this, which is called a pin pusher, and exactly like the name suggests, it pushes pins. And finally we have a pair of pliers, which I don't tend to use for blocking, but they're very handy for getting the pins out of the block once you've finished. Oh, and one more thing is this, which is a piece of cane. And again, it's not a blocking pin, but it's something that we use in blocking sometimes that's handy, and I want to show you that as well. So I'm going to go and grab a block and some pins and all my blocking stuff, and we're going to have a look at the different pins and see how they work. Okay, here we are. I've got my block and it's covered. I've used plastic wrap here. You need to cover your blocks so that you protect the block from getting dirty and also your work from getting dirty. If you get into the habit of doing it every time, then that's a better habit to be in. For instance, I'm going to be using this white paper capelline today to demonstrate, but you can imagine if I was actually making a hat out of this, and the previous block that previous material I used on this block was a navy blue cinema, for example. Some of the dye from the cinema may have come off onto the block, and if I go ahead and block this, then I'm going to have blue dye possibly come through on my nice white capelline. So the first blocking pin I'm going to demonstrate are these, the thumbtacks or drawing pins, and quite simply we use them to push in with a thumb like that. Pretty easy to do. In this example I'm not having to pull on this capelline very much, so it's just more a demo of the actual pins here. And so what you would do is, if you needed to use blocking pins, you would go around the block like this, putting in your drawing pins. On this example we don't need many pins because it's blocked down quite well, but if you're blocking something, some sort of fabric like cinema or a woven fabric like that, then on the bias part you're going to have to be pulling down a lot with this hand here. In some places on the block you'll need to put in a lot of pins close together, and this is one disadvantage with drawing pins, because I can't put them very close to each other, or it's hard to put them very close to each other. And also because of the short size of the pin, I can have trouble placing the pin where I want it to go. So that's one disadvantage with these, but as you can see they're pretty easy to put in. Another slight disadvantage with these is they're hard to angle the pin in a certain direction. And another thing with blocking is you want to have your pins out here ready to go on the table or in a box like this, whichever you prefer, but have them ready for you so you're not having to hunt around. Again, we'll pop these ones in. They're quite easy to put in, much the same as the drawing pins. The same disadvantages and advantages, so easy to push in, but I can't get them very close together and I have trouble angling them in the correct way. But also, if you notice, I've got this pin in not all the way, and if I just push on them, they also come out very easily. So I'm just sort of fiddling with that pin, and if I take those out, you can notice that that's bent. So they're a lot easier to bend. If I go back to these drawing pins, then it's not easy to bend them, but if I fiddle around with them like this, then they're quite easy to make a bigger hole in your block. One final disadvantage that I want to talk about is with these red pins. I've had people tell me that they've been blocking, and when they take the pins out, they've got this red mark left. So do be careful with that. Try out your pins first. And next I'm going to move on to these fine lace pins that I bought as blocking pins from a supplier. So now I'm going to need my thimble. As always with these type of pins, you need a thimble to put them in by hand. And if I go to put them in the block, the trouble I have with this pin is it doesn't stick out from my fingers here. So there's no way I can actually guide this pin and push it in with my fingers. There you go. I've actually put it in a little bit, but it's only in like a millimeter. So to me, these pins are pretty useless if you're blocking like this. There is one way to put them in, and that's with a pin pusher. So if you're lucky enough to own a pin pusher, then you can use these pins. There you go. I'll put them in like that. The disadvantage to using a pin pusher is that you need two hands to do it. When I'm blocking, this hand is manipulating the fabric. My body is holding the block usually, and this hand is putting the pins in. But with a pin pusher, I need to take this hand off the work, pick up the pin to put it in the pusher, and then I have to grab this material again. Again, on this particular piece of blocking, that doesn't matter so much because I'm hardly blocking it at all. I'm just holding it there. But if you're blocking something that's a little bit more complex, you really need this hand and that pressure to stay. And so using a tool to put pins in is a great disadvantage to blocking. The second disadvantage is it's so easy to put pins in with this pin pusher that it's very easy to put them in a long way. And that means it's very hard to take them out. And also you're doing more damage to your block. So these ones, if you're used to blocking by hand, are absolutely useless. But you can use that pin pusher. Then I'm going to move on to our final pin for demo, which is these blocking pins that we sell at Millinery Hub. Steel blocking pins, and again I use my thimble, picking up the pin like this between my thumb and forefinger, and that finger with the thimble goes behind there. Okay, so putting the pin in, again we just pick it up like that, and then I push down. And if I have my pins out here on the table, I can pick them up and put them in with one hand, and there's no need to take this hand off the work. There we go. They're quite easy to put. Whoops, there we go. I said quite easy, but to put on an angle, so that one's pointing up, that one's pointing down. Alright, so I just want to go into a little bit more of how to use these blocking pins from Millinery Hub, because this is probably the main disadvantage to these pins, but it's not a reason that you should avoid using them. And that is learning the technique of blocking with them can be a bit difficult. And when most people find when they start using these pins, they really hate them and they think they're never going to be able to block using these pins, but it just requires a little bit of practice and the right technique. So first of all, how do I pick up the pin? I want to have the pins down on my table here so I can pick them up between my first two my thumb and my first finger, right? And so I'm going to hold the pin like that. So the point is here, the point's sticking out, and I've got the pin between my thumb and first finger there. Now the next finger, my middle finger, has got the thimble on it, and the thimble needs to fit comfortably so it's not going to fall off my finger if I move it around, but it's not so tight that it's really annoying. That finger goes in behind the pin so that the head of the pin is resting against that finger. From the other side you can probably see that a little bit better. My fingers are forming a triangle there around the pin, and I really want to hold that pin quite firmly in this grip there. Then I want to put the pin wherever I want it on the block, and using my arm pushing it in. So it requires a bit of strength, it requires a little bit of getting used to holding it, but as you can see here, you can get quite quick at putting pins in with a bit of practice, and if you practice you can get quite fast at blocking in no time. But it does take practice, and you will most likely hate it for a start. But do persevere, because these are really the best blocking pins for blocking, in my opinion. Okay, one more view with these blocking pins, just so you can see what I'm doing when I'm blocking a little bit closer. So picking my pin up like that, with the pointy end sticking out between my thumb and first finger, popping my other finger with the thimble behind it, and then pushing into the block like that, picking up another pin and go straight into the block. Like that. I never move my fingers from that position when I'm blocking. I see a lot of people trying to push pins in like this with the thimble, but that slips off the thimble very easily and you can hurt yourself quite badly. So try not to do that. Try and force yourself, and after a little while you'll get used to this technique and it will be the best way of blocking. I know some people want to use a hammer to put them in, and if you really don't have the strength in your fingers to push these pins in, well, there's not a lot you can do about that apart from building up the strength in your fingers. However, using a hammer means that you've got no hands to control the fabric. Now, I haven't even got a hammer to show you, but the reason why that's really bad in blocking is you need this hand, or at least one hand, to be manipulating the fabric on the block while you're putting the pins in. If you're using a hammer, then you require two hands to put the pin in. One to hold the hammer, let's say these pliers are the hammer, and then one to hold the pin. So when I'm doing that, there's no possible way I can be holding down my material or getting it tight on the block, and that's the whole purpose of blocking. So I suppose if you can't put pins in very well like this, then if you can get them in a little way, that's when a hammer might be handy, just to give them a bit of a tap and put them in a little bit further. But if you're relying on the hammer to put your pins in from the start, it's a really bad way of blocking. So you want to try and practice using blocking pins with a thimble like this. It's really the best way to do it. Again, these are my favorite pins. These are the ones that I use when blocking. These are the ones that I recommend for several reasons. They're tough, they're thick enough not to bend, you can block with one hand, you do need a thimble, you can put them close together. If you're having trouble blocking, you can use a pin pusher with these as well. Just all round, they win out in so many categories, and that's why I use these pins. There's just one more thing that I want to show you about blocking, and that's using this cane. Okay, here we have a different block, and as you can see here, it's got a concave section there. So when we put our fabric over that to block, I'm just going to use a little bit of elastic here because it helps me illustrate the point a bit more. I'm going to put a couple of pins in there at the bottom and stretch that elastic and put a couple of pins in at the top here. There you go. See, I've bent that pin. That's one of the softer ones that I was talking about before. So that's where this softness of the pin comes into it. Alright, so I've got a couple of pins in either end, and you can see there, and we really don't want that when we're blocking this because we're missing out half the shape of the block. So how do we solve that? Well, we need to put some sort of something in there to hold it. We can put a blocking pin in, but the material can slip on the blocking pin, right? So we can put the blocking pin on a different angle to hold that down a bit, but still it's not all the way down there. You can see that dark part. So what do? Well, we need to use something to hold down our material, and it just so happens that cane is a really good way of doing that. A lot of milliners will use rope, but the advantage of cane over rope is that cane is firm, and if you have a pin here and here, then in between the pins it's still holding, that cane is still holding the fabric down, whereas rope does not. It's because it's so flexible. And so with the cane, I can do one of two things. I can put my pins through the cane, like that, or I can put them beside the cane, but put them on alternate angles. And if we have a look at that, I've put those two pins in. Here, I'll take that one out so you can see really well. So they're crossed over the cane, sort of like that, and the cane's in the middle. And so if you do that around, all the way around your block like this, then you can hold down your fabric really securely, and you don't need to use a heap of pins to get that shape into the block. That's why the cane's really good, but you can't do that as well with all the pins. If I use the drawing pin, for instance, there, then the pin can only go in so far, and it's not very far in, so it will come out very easily. Whereas these pins, you don't have that problem. Obviously it's going to be the same with these red drawing pins, and the little pins, well, you can't put them in by hand, but you could use those on the cane. And so that's using cane. This is what I use the pliers for, and for taking out pins. They can be really handy because if you're taking them out by hand, if they're in a soft block and they're only in a little way, then that can be easy. But when you have to wiggle the pin to get it out, that's putting a lot bigger, it's creating a lot bigger hole in your block, whereas you can just use pliers to give you that bit of advantage. And you can see here I'm using the pliers, there's a little bit of a lever, so pushing them against the block here, and these pins come out really easily in that way, and I'm not wiggling them round to make a bigger hole in my block. You can also use them to get our drawing pins. One disadvantage again of drawing pins, I'll see if I can do it on this, is if you, no, it's not going to work, but sometimes these heads come off and then you've got a pin in there in your block. Okay, so let's take a little bit of a look at the block under here. There we go. So we can see they're the holes of my drawing pins there. One of them I've twisted around a little bit, so it's a bit exaggerated. And then we have our red pins, which are significantly smaller, and our little lace pins, which are smaller again, smaller holes. Then my normal blocking pins are there, which are a bit larger, but they're not as large as these drawing pins. So you can see there that using a little bit smaller pins is a good thing for your block in the long run. But it's not the only consideration. So that's my take on blocking pins. I hope you've learnt something. As always, if you've got questions, you can either comment on this video or you can head to the Millinery Hub website where you'll find all my contact details. And of course, if you want to buy some blocking pins, that's a great place to do it as well. Bye for now, and I'll see you next time.